Very good Monday morning to you. I'm Jim Sciutto. And this morning, new questions in an expanding scandal over the Trump Justice Department, who else it targeted, and why. Democratic lawmakers are demanding answers, calling now on Donald Trump's former attorneys general, both Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions, to testify under oath. This over the Trump DOJ's secret seizures, and they were secret, by the way, of data records of prominent Democrats and news organizations. CNN also learned it was not just political critics and press organizations Trump's DOJ targeted. Last month, former White House counsel Don McGahn and his wife received disclosures from Apple that their records were sought as well back in 2018. This as current Attorney General Merrick Garland is meeting today with the leaders of CNN, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, all of whose journalists were targeted to go over the leak investigations carried out by the DOJ under former President Trump. Also this morning, President Biden is in Brussels for his first in-person summit as president with NATO. It comes ahead of his highly anticipated meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday. We will be there for it in Geneva. Let's begin, though, with CNN's Lauren Fox on Capitol Hill for more on Democratic leaders now calling on Barr and Sessions to testify about those secret subpoenas. You and I, Lauren, have covered the last couple of years a lot of times when congressional subpoenas were ignored by members of the Trump administration. Do we expect such subpoenas to be issued, but do we expect them to be listened to?
Well, Jim, I think this is going to have to play out a little bit up here on Capitol Hill. First, they are going to request that Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions testify before Congress. There's a lot of interest in getting more answers into specifically why members of Congress and staff might have been targeted or whether or not they were just sort of part of this widespread dragnet to try to get more information on this metadata that was being collected by the Justice Department under former President Donald Trump. Now, I think one of the key questions up here on Capitol Hill is how far Democrats want to actually go to pursue this. Are they going to try to subpoena, like you said, Jeff Sessions or Bill Barr, or are they simply going to make these requests and see what happens? I think all of that has to be given a little bit of time. This is the first time that lawmakers are going to be back on Capitol Hill this week after that news broke late Thursday. So I think that is what's going to happen up here on Capitol Hill. Meanwhile, Democrats very clear that they have some deep concerns about what is alleged to have happened. Here's what they said.
What has happened here are fingerprints of a dictatorship, not a democracy.
What the administration did, the Justice Department, the leadership of the former president, goes even beyond Richard Nixon.
And one thing that Pelosi made very clear yesterday when she appeared on CNN was that she's not quite sure how it has happened that both Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr have said they had no idea about these dragnet searches. Now, she says that that's pretty unbelievable, and she says it's beyond the pale. So a lot of questions here as to what those former attorneys generals knew and when they knew it. Democrats pledging they're going to try to get to the bottom of it. Jim?
Lord Fox? We'll see if they're able to. Thanks very much. CNN has now learned that the Justice Department also obtained records belonging to President Trump's own former White House counsel, Don McGahn, and his wife. This back in 2018. CNN's Paula Reed, she has been covering this story. Paula, there are really two possibilities here, as I understand it. Either McGahn was a target of this leak investigation in some way, or that his communications were kind of scooped up because he was in communication perhaps with someone who was a target. Do we know? Do we know at this point?
At this point, Jim, we don't have an answer to that question. One of many in this investigation. We've been talking to many sources, and at this point, it's just not clear. I just got off the phone with someone at the Justice Department. It's just not clear whether he was swept up in some other investigation or if he was being specifically targeted. But, Jim, we know this is an extraordinary step by the Trump Justice Department to secretly request the records of the then president's top lawyer. And Apple was barred from disclosing this request until this past May, which means that the Justice Department repeatedly had to go before a judge to insist on keeping this secret. Now, what's also notable is that this request came around the same time. They were seeking those requests for records of Democratic lawmakers. And what we have here is a pattern of requests, these unusual requests that appear to be related to leak investigations, but they also connect to people the president at that time was very unhappy with. Yes, Don McGahn was his top lawyer, but the president was increasingly frustrated with McGahn over the president's desire that McGahn begin the process to fire then special counsel Robert Mueller. And what's even more extraordinary here is that a source tells CNN that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions and then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein didn't know about this request. Look, Jim, something about that just does not add up. That the Justice Department would make an extraordinary request like this, and the two top officials at the Justice Department knew nothing about it. Some former officials have suggested that's just not possible. Other people have suggested that maybe these folks were all swept up, but at some point that likely would have been reported to a supervisor.
It's either misleading or, you might say, bad oversight. Paula Reed, thanks so much. Well, joining me now is a former U.S. Attorney General under the George W. Bush administration, Alberto Gonzales. He also served as White House counsel to President Bush. He's now the dean of the Belmont University College of Law. Sir, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Jim, it's a pleasure. This is a very unusual story. I find it's bizarre that the
Well, let's
White House
talk about
counsel,
that, because previous administrations have pursued leak investigations, the Obama administration included, which at times involved journalists, although in those cases, I believe the journalists were investigated as possible conspirators, not just in communication potentially with government officials. What's unique here is the scale. Dozens of accounts, including of family members of people in this investigation, but also that it targeted two Democratic lawmakers, a host of others. Did the Trump administration, in your view, break disturbing new ground here?
Well, look, let's make some assumptions. Let's assume that what's being reported is true. And quite frankly, we really need to wait for the investigation by the IG. And of course, there'll be investigations by Congress before we fully know and are comfortable that we know all of the facts. So let's just assume that they're true. Typically, of course, prosecutors have a great deal of discretion in engaging in investigations and prosecuting cases. Now, that discretion is cabined when you're talking about involving the press or records or, records of the press or members of a separate branch of government. In that case, there is a heightened scrutiny. There's a heightened need to get this information in order to move forward on a prosecution. So it is very extraordinary as a general matter, but the notion that senior officials of the Department of Justice were unaware of what was going on here is really troubling, because that would mean, if in fact the facts are true, that there were individuals operating within the Department of Justice who probably were doing things that they should have gotten sign-off from their superiors before moving forward.
Let me ask you about that, because both Sessions and Barr are saying they didn't know about it. You served as Attorney General, a very powerful position at the top of the Department of Justice. Do you buy that explanation? I mean, either it's misleading or, would you call that good leadership to not know about a scale of subpoenas like this?
Listen, there are over 100,000 employees that work at the Department of Justice. At any one time, somebody's probably doing something they shouldn't be doing. Now, this is extraordinary, no question about it. But it's possible that the leadership at the top did not know what was going on. Now, of course, they should have known, and there are protocols in place that would require generally for lower-level employees, even those that hold Senate-confirmed positions. If you're talking about a subpoena with respect to the White House counsel, or a member of the media, or a member of Congress, generally that goes up to the Attorney General, or at least the Deputy Attorney General. And so, again, it's possible they didn't know about it, but I think it would be highly extraordinary, and it would mean that there were people operating within the Department of Justice who were doing something that they should have gotten permission or at least notified their superiors. This is something that they believed was absolutely necessary, no other way to get the information. And, again, this is something that as a general matter, does involve the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General.
To get a gag order, though, would you not need the Attorney General to approve? Because these were quite expansive gag orders, only expiring now. And that's why we're finding out about this now, because the companies, Apple among them, Microsoft as well, can now let the targets of those subpoenas know that they were targeted.
Well, typically, yes. In the usual case, it would require, again, sign-off approval by the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General. No question about it, Jim. So there's some of the facts here I, again, find bizarre and amazing. Yeah. I don't know whether or not the reporting is completely accurate because of that reason. And I, quite frankly, I'm hopeful the reporting is inaccurate because otherwise it paints a picture.
With respect, we know many of the facts here. For instance, CNN's reporter has gone public with being notified, as have other targets of these investigations, as they've been notified by Apple. So they're not making this up.
What we don't know, Jim, for example, is what is the investigation about? What is the scope of the what's being targeted here? What other sources of information exist out there that the department says we can't get this information any other way? So there is a lot. I'm just suggesting there's a lot here that we don't know yet.
Okay. Well, what predicate then, to use a legal term, what justification would be necessary in your view to justify, right, an investigation, a dragnet, as it were, this broad?
Well, of course, we're talking about some serious issues or serious commissions of large-scale crime here. So, and the predicate would be, again, as I indicated before, there is an absolute need to do this. There is no other way to get this information and move forward on a legitimate investigation or prosecution. Again, because you're involving members of the media, members of another branch of government, members perhaps in the White House, you're talking about a very high bar that would have to be met in order to move forward with some kind of investigation of this nature.
Okay, so just test this out for me. Could all these things be true? Could it be such a serious threat to national security, require so many subpoenas, right, including of lawmakers and journalists and family members of people involved, and the Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General not know about it? How could all those things be true?
Highly unlikely, Jim. Highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. Is it possible? I suppose it's possible, but it's highly unlikely. Yes. I mean, protocols are in place. People understand what those protocols are. They know what the rules are. They know that with respect to certain kinds of subpoenas, for example, you've got to get approval higher up. And so, is it possible? It's possible, but it's, again, highly unlikely. But they did know about it. And yet, on the other hand, Jim, I've got to tell you, when a former attorney general says publicly, I didn't know about this. I mean, to me, that carries a great deal of weight.
Sure.
So I can't imagine that they would lie about it. Now, listen, they're not under oath, no question about it. But nonetheless, to make a public statement like that, boy, it would take some nerve to make a public statement because it's going to come out. People are going to find out what the truth is.
Yeah, I'm just testing how all those things could be true. It could be such a huge threat, but they wouldn't know about it, and yet it was justified. I mean, listen, a lot of questions to be answered here. You're right. Alberto Gonzalez, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.